Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member of ASA. It costs me $50 Australian a year, which I think is quite a bargain. It's even less for people who are unwaged. But if you can't afford membership with ASA, you can also engage with the organisation by following them on Facebook, by subscribing to their newsletter, and also by just looking them up at their website. So think about engaging with ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, let's get down to our business. Now, this episode is coming to you from the beautiful campus of the University of Wollongong. It's a lovely bush campus, and I'm here for a fantastic animal studies conference. I think I've been mispronouncing it, but that's quite traditional for me. So Animal Ladies 2 are organised by the wonderful Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and also the equally wonderful Laurie Gruen. So I am again able to convince one of the speakers at the conference to join me for Knowing Animals, someone who until recently I wasn't aware of his work, but I've been very impressed hearing him speak for the last few days, and I think you will be too. So this week I'm joined by Darren Chang. Darren has a Master's in Political Philosophy from Queen's University, where he worked under the supervision of Will Kymlicka. Presently, Darren is living in Toronto and working on a project that aims to transform a farm animal zoo in the city into an urban farm sanctuary. And today we're going to discuss Darren's upcoming book chapter titled Examining Contemporary Indigenous Struggles and Animal Advocacy Through the Commercial Seal Hunt. It's going to appear in an upcoming book called Decolonizing Critical Animal Studies, which is edited by Chloe Taylor and Kelly Struthers, Montford. And it's going to be published by Brill. It'll be out in 2019. Welcome to the podcast, Darren.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, Darren, take us through it. What inspired this work?
I would say when I first came into doing animal advocacy and other social justice work on the west coast of Canada, there has always been a very strong culture of within the grassroots social justice movements there, of showing respect to the Indigenous peoples of that area. That is very much, always reiterated and reinforced through things like land acknowledgement and talking about the importance of supporting Indigenous and First Nations activists in their struggles to defend the land, defend their communities. So that has always been familiar to me, that in order to effectively overcome, destructive capitalist and violent capitalist forces and colonial forces, it is very important to support Indigenous struggles. So that was all about probably 6 or 7 years ago when I first started doing this kind of work. And fast forward to about just 2 years ago, this documentary called Angry Inuk was released. It was made by filmmaker and Inuit filmmaker Alethea Anakakbaril, and it's very much a defense of the Inuit participation in the commercial seal hunt in Canada. And of course, the commercial seal hunt, as many listeners would probably know, have been heavily targeted by Western animal advocacy and environmental nonprofit organizations over the past few decades. Organizations such as Greenpeace, Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, PETA, Humane Society International. So I guess the main argument of the film, there are several main points made in the film. One was that targeting the seal hunt through campaigns such as the ones that got the European Union to ban the import and sale of seal products was actually very much hurting the Inuit communities in the north, because they economically depended on that trade. And despite there being an exemption made in those bans for Inuit people to continue trading their products, it was the ban did not consider that the Inuit people depended on the commercial trade, and essentially dictated that they could only continue to hunt seals and use their bodies for traditional and subsistence reasons. And the other point was that that these Western nonprofits, NGOs, they were targeting the seal hunt strategically for fundraising reasons, and in that process, they unfairly and unethically used a lot of imperialist and racist types of language, and really took advantage and exploited that power dynamic. And it was easy to get supporters to donate money and get on board with the campaigns when the targets are marginalized and oppressed Indigenous peoples. So I was very much moved when I saw this documentary. And for me, I, as an animal rights and animal liberation activist, obviously, I personally don't like to see seals being killed, but at the same time, I understand the importance of respecting Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and autonomy in deciding within their own communities what is best and how to approach these issues related to human, non-human animal relations. And oftentimes it is not our place as settlers, and if not outright descendants of colonists, to reproduce these forms of violence through imperialistic sort of campaigns and strategies in order to change a community's practices and culture. So that prompted me to write this paper, to really take a closer look at all the different kinds of positions and perspectives that were taken in the seal hunt. Because the thing is, despite agreeing with many of the critiques that Arnakak Brill offered in her film, I also felt that the animal advocates definitely had really good arguments and points that they were making too. For example, they commonly or often would attribute blame to the Canadian government for being the real sort of the bad guy that is providing subsidies to this violent capitalist industry that is killing hundreds of thousands of seals year after year, despite knowing that the demand for seal products was starting to dry up, and that they're doing this because they wanted to get political support from both the Inuit communities and the East Coast sealers or seal hunters, and they also had their own agenda, which is the reason why they want this type of political support, is because they wanted to work with corporations to do more resource extraction in the north, things such as mining or offshore drilling. And so I see this tension where, on the one hand, we don't want to see. I guess the tension is this: it's understanding that Indigenous peoples, and in this case the Inuit peoples, are on the front lines defending the environment, defending the ocean. They're the ones fighting, as Brill says in an article, they're the ones who are advocating for whale sanctuaries in the area and really protecting the ecological environment. But they struggle financially to support themselves and sustain their communities, and that's why they rely on the seal hunt. And so it is an injustice and very unfair for animal advocates to put extra burden on them while they're doing this kind of important work, while also recognizing that it is unfair to the seals. So it became this really frustrating lose-lose kind of situation. So I began exploring what alternatives there might be that could turn this into a win-win situation, I guess, for everybody. And I was engaging with some Indigenous scholars and activists' theories on this sort of struggle between Indigenous peoples wanting to live in traditional and ethical ways in relationship to the environment and to the land that is antithetical and challenges Western sort of private property type relations and exploitative and dominating relations with the environment, while also acknowledging that they want to be seen as modern, they want to be seen as contemporary, and which is why they feel this sort of desire to not be made invisible in a modern industry like the commercial seal hunt. So one of the ways that I propose we could resolve these issues is by adopting Indigenous epistemologies and their worldviews and how they choose to engage with the land, with the rest of the world, and with settlers. And here I'm informed by the work of Indigenous scholar and activist Glenn Coulthard, who works at the University of British Columbia. So in his book, Red Skin, White Masks, he proposed this theoretical and practical framework that he calls grounded normativity, which is a way in which people, and particularly Indigenous peoples, could live in reciprocal relationships with the land in a non-exploitative and non-dominating way, in a very respectful way. And so in this instance, it would grounded normativity, to practice it, would not just be a struggle for the land, but to actually learn from the land and the other living and non-living entities, such as trees, plants, non-human animals, rocks, rivers, and how all these entities are actually teaching Indigenous peoples the importance of of reciprocity in order for all life to be sustained and are able to thrive over time. And the reason, one of the important things here is to understand why it is that Coulthard proposes this theoretical framework. And the reason is because he is very critical, informed by revolutionaries and theorists like Frantz Fanon. He's really critical of what he calls a colonial politics of recognition, in which settler colonial states often are very quick to, well, maybe not so quick, but would be at least willing to, after being pressured, would be willing to acknowledge and recognize First Nations rights, various types of rights, whether it's cultural or language rights, but they would never recognize land rights, and they would always settler colonial states and governments would always assume sovereignty over Indigenous people's land, and so he's really trying to challenge what he describes as a misrecognition of Indigenous subjectivity from the state that treats Indigenous peoples, for example, as the wards of the state and always disempowering them and dominating them. So grounded normativity becomes this very empowering way for Indigenous peoples to disengage with this politics of recognition. and instead, recognize their own power and subjectivity. Yes. So going from that, I basically propose, informed by grounded normativity, it makes sense that perhaps Western NGOs and nonprofits could sort of, take a lesson from that and understand that, for example, that the government of Canada not only doesn't have the interests of Indigenous peoples in mind, but also don't care about the seals at all, as it has been clearly demonstrated. And so why not participate in this radical form of disengagement and instead work directly with Indigenous and First Nations communities and support their struggles and build that meaningful relationship of trust, so that we could better communicate with each other. And so one of the things that I proposed that NGOs could do is to actually participate in a process of reparation. One reason, it's because of that critique that much of their fundraising activities in the past has been arguably racist and unethical. And for those reasons, those are good reasons why they should participate in reparation. But I think generally and more broadly, colonial settlers, have this sort of duty and obligation for those of us who do want to repair historical injustices, reparation in whatever kind of way that we can to the best of our abilities, whether it's financial or other abilities, we should actively contribute and participate in that. And so if you look at Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd, these are massive organizations with millions upon millions of dollars. They could easily fund projects that would better ensure food security, food sovereignty for the northern communities that are actually struggling with securing access to healthy food in a sustainable way. So we're talking about, and this has been covered by mainstream media internationally, when people are just completely shocked that to buy a head of cabbage in the north costs you $28, for example. These ridiculous kinds of outrageous food prices, and so some nonprofit organizations have begun working directly, seeing that there is a need and a demand from the Inuit communities to build these types of greenhouses that would allow them to produce, plant-based foods or plant foods more sustainably. So that became one of the primary examples in which I felt that NGOs could work directly with Indigenous peoples to empower each other, instead of unnecessarily being made out to be enemies against each other by external forces like corporations that have resource extraction agendas or interests in the North, or the Canadian government. Yes.
Now, Darren, you also write about the role the seals themselves play in resisting. Can you say a little bit about how you think about that issue and why it was important for you to talk about the seals as individuals with agency, I should say?
Sure. So that was the final part of the paper, and I was considering whether if we are able to move towards a future in which violence and exploitation against seals is no longer necessary for subsistence, for survival, for economic gains, anything, then are we able to start moving towards thinking about seals differently as well? And part of that, again, is informed by Glenn Coulthard's work, because in his theory of grounded normativity, he talks about, this respectful way of recognizing that humans are not the only living beings on the land who possess agency or spirit, and that he also recognizes that Indigenous peoples would also recognize that in other animals as well. And And the other thing that he mentions in his book is he recognizes how in settler colonial states, oftentimes, for example, in places like Canada or Australia, Indigenous populations have been so decimated that they are, they're currently the minority population, and they understand being in that position. They're not going to be able to effectively try to decolonize themselves without the support of other social justice movements. And they have to build coalitions with other groups and movements who share similar struggles against oppressive forces, whether it's, for example, the labor movement fighting against capitalism, or LGBTQ two-spirit communities, fighting against heteropatriarchy. And so I basically question that if we're able to recognize seals as political agents and animals who are resisting and fighting back for their own lives and against these destructive forces in their own ways, which other scholars in the field of critical animal studies have done a lot of work on, looking at conceptualizations of animal resistance, and so would there be a way for would there be a place for seals and other non-human animals in general to participate in these anti-colonial and anti-capitalist and generally anti-oppressive struggles? So that was I left that more kind of as an open question, and that's that. Yes.
Fascinating. Well, Darren, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I don't remember precisely what it was, but I definitely remember I took this. I would call it a life-changing course, a seminar in the 4th year of my undergrad with Professor Laura Genera at the University of British Columbia. And so she's a political theorist, and the course was called Political Theory and Non-Human Life. So that was the first time that I came into engagement with scholarship that actually took a critical look at human-animal relations and other relationships as well, with food and with the plants, with the land.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, so at the time, towards my final year in my undergraduate degree, I had an opportunity to work as a research assistant with the animal welfare program at University of British Columbia, and they're very much science-based. They try to use scientific methods to improve the lives of animals in a very welfarist kind of approach. And I had an opportunity to work in actually lab rats for a friend who was doing her PhD at the time, looking at how to improve the lives of rats. And at around the same time, all this literature in animal studies was coming out, talking about animal agency and things like that. So I wrote this paper I remember calling it Solidarity with Laboratory Rats, where I was looking at my friend Joanna Mikowska's work, which was brilliant in many ways, where she was finding opportunities to allow rats to express their personalities and agencies in a very oppressive laboratory setting. And so I was really inspired by that, and I took a critical look at that project and thought about if it's possible for us to act in solidarity with rats in such ways.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I would say the book Zoopolis by Sue Donaldson, Will Kymlicka definitely made a big difference for me. I guess a big part of it was because of the discipline. So my background is in political philosophy and theory, so I was able to relate to that. But then more recently, I would say Sunara Taylor's book, Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation. That just sort of took my thinking to, I guess, a whole other level of, yes, yeah.
Fantastic. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
So here I would, I guess, reiterate what I've heard from Dinesh Wadawal, who talks about this important practice of slowing down and finding opportunities to think slowly and carefully through complicated issues. And I think academics at a university setting has the opportunity and privilege to partake in that practice. And I think here I'm also thinking of Soko and Afko, who are two sisters, and they have written on the connections between speciesism and anti-Black racism, and for them they talk about how so often this theorizing work and the work of thinking carefully about various interconnected issues are not appreciated and respected by grassroots activists as legitimate work. And so we should change that view and change that culture and appreciate that this is as much a form of activist labor as, say, protesting and doing outreach on the street, things like that. So those two things really inform me of the role of the academic within the movement. Interesting.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
That's a tricky one, because there are so many things that we like to change, but I guess I think ideally it would be a situation in which animals would be afforded as much freedom and opportunity as possible to dictate their lives on their own terms, ultimately, regardless of what species and what kind of animal.
Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
Here at Wollongong, I actually presented an outline, basically, of something that I want to work on more in the future, which is to consider how farmed animal sanctuaries are in a strategic position to participate and contribute to anti-colonial struggles. And so I think I might delve deeper into that in the future.
Wonderful. And how can people find out more about your work?
I don't have a lot of work available online at this point or anything like that, but yeah, I guess that would be something more so for the future. Yeah.
Okay, so you're a man of mystery at this stage, but people can look out for your book chapter?
Yes.
Yes. Wonderful.
Decolonizing Critical Animal Studies, coming out hopefully next year.
Wonderful. 2019.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can find us very easily online. We have a Knowing Animals Twitter account, which is at knowing_animals. I've got a Twitter account, which is at SO_S. Knowing Animals also has a Facebook account and a Instagram feed. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.